Hey, how's it going? This video is going to be how to make sense of all the different stimulant formulations available. So we'll go through a way of making sense of all the different amphetamines and all the different methylphenidates. So we know that stimulants are the first line treatment for ADHD. And there are a ton of different drugs available. There's over 30 different formulations of stimulants. So it can seem overwhelming to learn the differences between them, but I'm going to make it super simple so that by the end of this video, you know all the differences between all the different formulations. And I'm going to do that by looking at the four major ways that stimulants differ. So I'll be looking first at amphetamines versus methylphenidates, second at the different isomer mix, third at the different forms of administration, and fourth at the different delivery systems / duration of action. So let's get right to it. First, we're starting with methylphenidate versus amphetamine. So even though there are a ton of different stimulants for ADHD, they all distill down to two ingredients, methylphenidate and amphetamine. So first, let's just start with the mechanism of action. So these two drugs have overlapping but distinct mechanisms. Methylphenidate acts as an antagonist to dopamine and norepinephrine reuptake. So similar to how SSRIs work with serotonin, it blocks reuptake of DAT and NET, which leads to more dopamine and norepinephrine in the synapse. Now, amphetamines, they also block the reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine through DAT and NET, but they have an additional mechanism on top of this. So amphetamines are what we call pseudosubstrates. So a pseudosubstrate refers to a molecule that mimics the structure of a natural substrate. So it's not surprising when we look at the chemical structures of amphetamines, they're incredibly similar to dopamine and norepinephrine. So when amphetamine is taken at high doses, as a pseudosubstrate, it gets taken into the neuron. And in the presynaptic neuron, it targets the vesicles that contain the neurotransmitters. And more specifically, it targets VMAT2, which stands for vesicular monoamine transporter 2. This is like a little tube that transports the dopamine or the norepinephrine into the vesicle. So it acts as a pseudosubstrate here, where it displaces the stored neurotransmitters. So basically it leads to elevated levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in the cell, which it then gets released into the synapse. So I simplified this all a little bit, but the gist is that methylphenidate blocks the reuptake of norepinephrine and dopamine. Amphetamines also do this, but at high doses, they also displace stored dopamine and norepinephrine, releasing even more neurotransmitter into the synapses. So this additional mechanism of action may help explain why amphetamines have a higher abuse potential and why they lead to more euphoric effects. So now let's look at the differences between amphetamines and methylphenidate. So we know that on average, amphetamines have a better effect size than methylphenidate, but it's typically pretty modest. When we look at who has good responses to these medications, we see that about 40% of patients respond really well to both, and then about 28% respond better to amphetamines, and 15% respond better to methylphenidate. A big meta-analysis found that methylphenidate had a better acceptability in kids, and that amphetamines had better acceptability in adults. So acceptability is a metric that measures the proportion of participants who left the study for any reason. So given that these drugs have a potential for abuse and euphoria, it's not the best metric for measuring how patients do on a medication. And I mention this because we know that amphetamines have more side effects. So amphetamines probably have a higher risk of mania and psychosis compared to methylphenidate. And it's not 100% clear, but it seems like methylphenidate does a lot better with comorbidities. So it might do better with regards to suicide, with borderline personality disorder, with OCD. And one of the bigger ones is that amphetamines are worse with regards to abuse potential. And lastly, whether these medications are neuroprotective or neurotoxic is not really clear cut. So their long-term effects aren't completely understood, and it's very likely that it depends on the dosage and for how long it's taken. But in general, it seems like methylphenidate does a little bit better in regards to neuroprotection. So to summarize the differences between methylphenidate and amphetamines, methylphenidate in general is a safer medication, has less abuse potential, it's better tolerated, but it may be a little bit less effective. So in my personal opinion, I think amphetamines are a more potent medication and a riskier medication, so I think it makes sense to use methylphenidate first. So that caps up the first major distinction between the different stimulants of amphetamines versus methylphenidates. And now let's move to the second big way that stimulant formulations differ. And that has to do with their isomer mix. And this is going to sound confusing, but I promise it's not as complicated as it sounds. So both amphetamine and methylphenidate have two enantiomers. So enantiomers are molecules that are mirror images of each other. So the best example is your left and your right hand. So your left and your right hand are mirror images. So they look incredibly similar, but you can't superimpose them on one another. And the enantiomers can have different effects on the body. And we see this a decent amount in psych drugs. So we see citalopram and escitalopram We see ketamine and S-ketamine and modafinil and R-modafinil. So for the amphetamines, the left hand is levoamphetamine and the right hand is dextroamphetamine. For methylphenidate, the left hand is levomethylphenidate and the right hand is dexmethylphenidate. So first, let's look at the amphetamine enantiomers. So dextroamphetamine is 2 to 4 times more potent than levoamphetamine. And we also know that levoamphetamine lasts longer and it has a higher risk of cardiac effects. So one little simplification I like to think about is that dextroamphetamine has a higher effect on dopamine and levoamphetamine has a higher effect on norepinephrine. So it's the dextroamphetamine that causes more of the euphoria and the mental stimulation, and it's the levoamphetamine that causes more of that jittery fight or flight stimulation and has more of the effects on the cardiovascular system. And then looking at methylphenidate, so it's dexmethylphenidate that's considered the pharmacologically active form. So it's dexmethylphenidate that accounts for nearly all the drug's potency. So the levomethylphenidate doesn't do much pharmacologically, but it might prolong the elimination of the dextromethylphenidate. So it extends the duration of action of the dextromethylphenidate, and it might pull down the peak a little bit. So now knowing all this information, we now have one way that we can split up all the different stimulants. So just a small pause in the video. If you enjoyed this content or my other content, definitely head over to psycho.farm and check out the new antidepressant course. So I put together a course with a ton of videos that go over depression, SSRIs, SNRIs, TCAs, MAOIs, and the atypicals. I made it with the intent to be accessible and practical. I think it's worthwhile if you're a student or a practicing psychiatrist, you'll still get something out of it. But let's get back to the video. So even though all these different stimulants have a ton of different names and a ton of different release mechanisms, they all end up being D and L amphetamine or D and L methylphenidate. So methylphenidates come in 2 different isomer mixes. So there's formulations that come in a racemic mixture. So racemic is just a fancy way of saying it's 50% the D enantiomer and 50% the L enantiomer. So racemic just means the mixture has both the left and the right hand. And then there's formulations that come as just dexmethylphenidate. So to say that again, there's 2 different isomer mixes for methylphenidates. It either comes as all dexmethylphenidate or it comes as a 50-50 mix of the 2 enantiomers. Amphetamines come in 3 different isomer mixes. So it either comes as pure dextroamphetamine, then it also comes in a 1-to-1 ratio of the D and L enantiomer, which is the racemic mixture, and then it also comes in a 3-to-1 ratio of dextroamphetamine to levoamphetamine. So to say that again, amphetamines come in 3 different isomer mixes, and those 3 are 100% dextroamphetamine, 75% dextroamphetamine, or 50% dextroamphetamine. Let's take a look at one of the most popular stimulants, Adderall, to make more sense of this. So Adderall is called mixed amphetamine salts, and it's because it contains 4 different salts of amphetamine. So when we look, it's 25% dextroamphetamine sulfate, 25% dextroamphetamine saccharate, 25% amphetamine sulfate, and 25% amphetamine aspartate monohydrate. So it sounds super confusing, but it's not. Just ignore the salts. The salt part, which is the sulfate and the saccharate and the aspartate monohydrate, they have nothing to do with the mechanism of action. How it works is that the salt comes off of the amphetamine and the salt does absolutely nothing and the amphetamine is entirely responsible for the effect. The different salts just make it so that it gets absorbed into the body at different rates. So by having a ton of different salts, it gives it a more consistent and extended release compared to just a single salt formulation. So like I said, in terms of the effect, the more important thing is the ratio of D to L amphetamine. So the fact that half the salts are a racemic mixture and half the salts are just D-amphetamine, that means it's a 3-to-1 ratio of D-amphetamine to L-amphetamine. So we can sort the different stimulants that are available by their isomer composition. So let's start with the amphetamines. You can get an isomer mixture that contains 50% D-amphetamine, and that's brand name Efficacy. Then there are the amphetamines that contain 75% D-amphetamine. So this includes Adderall, Adderall XR, Mydayis, Adzenys, Dianivil XR, Adzenys XR ODT, and Adzenys ER. In the next section, we'll learn the differences between these medications. Then there are the amphetamines that are 100% dextroamphetamine. These include Dexedrine, or brand name Zenzetti, Dexedrine XR, which is also called Spansules, Vyvanse, and Procentra. Then when we look at the methylphenidate brand names and their isomer compositions, the first composition would just be a racemic mixture of methylphenidate. This includes Ritalin, Methylin, Ritalin SR, Metadate ER and CD, Ritalin LA, Concerta, Aptensio XR, Adhancia, Jornay PM, Cotempla XR ODT, Quilichu ER, Quilivant XR, and Daytrana. Again, we'll learn the differences in the next section. Then there are the formulations that come as just dexmethylphenidate. That includes Focalin, Focalin XR, and Asteres. All right, this brings us to the third way that stimulants differ, and that's by their form of administration. So manufacturers have made stimulants available in a ton of different routes of administration. So they come in pills/tablets, orally dissolving tablets, chewables, liquids, and patches. So here's a nice chart of the different names of the medications and the form that they come in. So maybe you're wondering, why are there all these different ways of taking the stimulants? So it might be helpful to know that changing the form of administration of a medication can potentially extend the patent protection. So it's a strategy used by pharmaceutical companies to extend the patent of a drug. Now, the second reason there's a ton of different forms of stimulants is that these medications are used a lot in kids. So you can argue that a lot of these medications are easier for kids, especially those who have difficulty swallowing medications. So I'll just read out all the different ones that aren't the pill/tablet. So ODT stands for orally disintegrating tablet. So these are medications that dissolve in your mouth rather than needing to be swallowed. So there's a methylphenidate orally dissolving tablet, and that's Cotempla. And then there's an amphetamine orally dissolving tablet, and that's Adzenys XR. The next route of administration is chewable medications. So here's a methylphenidate that's brand name Quilichew ER. Quilichew kind of sounds like a Pokemon to me, but it's a cherry-flavored, chewable form of methylphenidate. And I should have mentioned Cotempla is grape-flavored, and Adzenys is orange-flavored. So yes, it does give me the heebie-jeebies that you can get your stimulant in any flavor. But it's not for me to judge how you choose to trick your children into taking stimulants. All right, the next form of administration is liquids. So by the wonderful people who brought you Quilichew, there's the liquid form Quilivant XR, which is a banana-flavored methylphenidate. I love the banana flavor. Oh boy. All right, so then there's also amphetamine liquids. So there's Adzenys ER and Dianavol XR. And Dianavol comes in bubblegum. Then there's also a liquid that's just the dextroamphetamine, and that's called Procentra. Procentra is also bubblegum flavored. All right, the last form of administration is patches, and that's brand name Daytrana. So Daytrana is a methylphenidate patch. Some benefits of the patch is it avoids first-pass metabolism. It sort of has an off switch in that you can remove the patch, and after you remove the patch, the medication stops working after like 2 to 3 hours. Downsides are that it can cause skin irritation, and the FDA warned us that for some people it caused a permanent loss of skin color. So it's the different delivery systems that play a big role in terms of the different stimulants' onset of action and duration of action. So the first stimulants that were available were instant release. So instant release medications are quickly absorbed in the bloodstream, so they have a rapid onset of action. But the issue is that the medications don't last very long. They have a short duration of action. Now, when we're talking instant release medications, I'm talking about Adderall. So when people say Adderall, they typically are referring to Adderall instant release. And the instant release methylphenidate is just called Ritalin. So these instant release medications have a rapid onset of action. So typically it starts working within 30 minutes of taking the medication. The issue is that it has a short duration of action. So when we're treating ADHD, we want a medication that covers the patient's symptoms throughout the whole day. So if you wanted to do that with an instant release medication, the patient would have to take multiple doses. This would mean that the patient's going to have a lot of peaks and valleys in regards to the blood concentrations. So these fluctuations in blood levels results in inconsistent symptom management, and it also increases the potential for abuse. So whenever you have a short-acting medication with a rapid onset of action, you know there's going to be an increased potential for misuse and abuse. And that's what we see with the instant release medications. It's a lot more common for people to use higher doses with the intent of experiencing euphoria rather than ADHD symptom management. All right, so to review all the instant release medications, for the amphetamines, there's Adderall with a duration of action of 4 to 6 hours and an isomer mix of 3 to 1. Then there's the instant release of just the pure dextroamphetamine. That's called Dexedrine or Zenzetti or Procentra. These have a duration of action of about 3 to 6 hours. Then there's an instant release of a racemic mixture, 1-to-1 ratio of amphetamine, and that's called Evykio. Then turning to the methylphenidates, as I mentioned before, there's an instant release methylphenidate, that's called Ritalin, and then there's the instant release of just the dexmethylphenidate, and that's called Focalin. and these have a duration of action of about 3 to 6 hours. So because of the limitations of the instant release medications, manufacturers have developed a ton of different ways to get the different stimulants into the body with the hopes of prolonging the duration of action and causing less of those peaks and valleys so that patients have a steady concentration of the medication throughout the day. So now let's go through the different brand names of the different release mechanisms that the stimulants have. So I'll start with the formulations that are similar to Adderall. So here I'm talking about 75% dextroamphetamine. So the first medication is Adderall XR, Adderall extended release, and it's a formulation that contains 50% immediate release beads and 50% delayed release beads. So half the beads are released immediately, and then half the beads are delayed release. So it makes the effect of using 2 different doses of the instant release Adderall given 4 hours apart. But when we look at the curve of the mean plasma concentration, we see it's actually a lot smoother than that. All right, then the next medication is Mydayis. So Mydayis takes the ideas of the beads and takes it one step further. So it uses a triple bead technology. So it consists of an immediate release component. These beads dissolve quickly in the stomach and give it a pretty quick onset of action. Then the second beads have a delayed release. They release at a pH of 5.5. And then the third set of beads have another delayed release. They get released at a pH of 7. So by being released at different pHs, it's getting released at different points in the GI system, leading to an extended duration of action. So by having 3 different beads, it has an even longer duration of action, typically of 14 to 16 hours. Then there are a few extended release ones that have different routes of administration, the ones that I talked about in the last video. So there's Adzenys XR ODT. This is just an orally dissolving tablet that's got a duration of action of 10 to 12 hours. Then there's Adzenys ER oral suspension. So this just comes in a liquid and has a duration of action of 10 to 12 hours. Then there's Dianivil XR, which is also a liquid and also has a duration of action of about 12 hours. All right, next we'll move on to medications that are 100% dextroamphetamine. So there's the immediate release, which is Dexedrine or Zenzetti or Procentra. Then there's the extended release called Dexedrine Spansels. So this contains 50% instant release and then 50% delayed release beads, and has a duration of action of about 10 to 12 hours. And there's also a dextroamphetamine patch, which is brand name Zellstrom. And then there's Vyvanse. So Vyvanse is lisdexamphetamine. It's what's called a prodrug. So the release mechanism here is pretty cool. So by being a prodrug, it means that the active ingredient, which is dexamphetamine, is chemically bonded to an inactive compound, which is just the amino acid lysine. So by being attached to a lysine, the dextroamphetamine is inactive, and it doesn't actually produce any therapeutic effects until the lysine is clipped off. So what happens is Vyvanse needs to get absorbed in the bloodstream, and then when it's in the blood, it encounters an enzyme that cuts off the lysine group. And it's this cutting that releases the active dextroamphetamine molecule. I picture just little scissors in the blood cutting off the useless lysine. So the release of the dextroamphetamine is determined by the rate of this enzymatic cleavage. So it's the enzyme that causes the medication to get released gradually into the bloodstream. So its release isn't influenced at all by the gut or by pH levels. It's just the metabolic enzymatic process that determines it. So we know that Vyvanse has a nice long duration of action, typically lasting about 10 to 14 hours. And the gradual release mechanism helps to minimize the fluctuation in drug levels that occurs with the immediate release or even some of the extended release formulations. And the prodrug formulation makes it harder to abuse, so it's believed to have less of an abuse potential than the other medications. All right, then just to wrap up the amphetamines, there's also the instant release of the racemic mixture of amphetamine, so that's 50% D-amphetamine, 50% L, and that's just Evykio. All right, now let's move to the different methylphenidates. So let's start with the racemic mixture of methylphenidates, so 50% Dex and levomethylphenidate. So first, there's just the instant release, which is Ritalin or Methylin, and that has a duration of action of 3 to 6 hours. Then there's Ritalin SR, Ritalin sustained release. This just has a waxy coating that's dissolved in the gut, which is relatively inconsistent, but does extend the duration of action to about 4 to 8 hours. Then there's also Metadate ER, which also contains a wax-based matrix, and has a similar duration of action of 4 to 8 hours. Then there are the methylphenidate medications that use the beads. So there's Ritalin LA, Ritalin long-acting. So this is a capsule that contains 50% instant release beads and 50% enteric-coated delayed release beads. Then there's also Metadate CD, which contains 30% instant release beads and 70% extended release beads. So the duration of the Ritalin one is 6 to 9 hours, and then the duration of the Metadate is about 8 to 9 hours. All right, so then the next medication is Concerta. So this uses a fancy delivery system called Oros, which is the osmotic controlled release oral delivery system. So it has an outer coating with a semi-permeable membrane and a small laser drilled hole. And then it has an inner core that contains the methylphenidate and an osmotic salt. So this will make no sense to you, but as it moves through the digestive system, water from the body is absorbed through the laser hole into the core, which creates a pressure gradient and pushes the methylphenidate through the laser hole. I have no idea. It makes no sense. I just like that it has lasers. So this provides a steady and gradual release of the methylphenidate in the blood, typically has a duration of action of about 12 hours. Then there are two of the newer ones, which are Adhencia XR and Abtensio XR. So for Adhencia, think enhances the duration of action. For Abtensio, think pick up the tempo. So Adhencia XR uses the multi-layered beads. It's got 20% instant release beads and then 80% controlled release beads, and has a really long duration of action of 13 to 16 hours. Like I said, enhances the duration of action. Then there's Abtensio XR, which is composed of 40% immediate release layer and then 60% controlled release layer. And this has a quicker onset of action than Concerta. So it picks up the tempo and then has a similar duration of action of 12 hours. All right, then for the methylphenidates, there's a lot of the ones that we reviewed in the last video. So there's Quilichew ER, which is an extended release chewable tablet with a duration of action of typically 8 hours. Then there's Quilivant XR, which is a liquid that contains 20% instant release and 80% extended release. Then there's Cotempla XR ODT, which is just an orally dissolving tablet that lasts 12 hours. Then there's the Daytrana patch, which lasts about 9 to 12 hours. And it's nice as it avoids first pass metabolism in the gut. Then there's a fancy medication called Jornay PM. So it has a unique extended release technology. It's mostly for kids who have a tough time taking medications in the morning. So you take the medication at night, and it's not until the morning that it starts to act. So it's not until it hits the colon that the methylphenidate is released. So it passes through the upper GI system completely intact. So 50% of the drug is gradually released between 10 to 14 hours after dosing, and then 50% of the drug is gradually released over 14 and 20 hours after dosing. Because it's got to get all the way to the colon, in the ad, it says it's not dependent on any single factor like pH or variations in the GI transit. All right, now we're moving on to the dexmethylphenidate formulations. So the first is just the immediate release dexmethylphenidate, which is called Focalin. It has a duration of action of 3 to 6 hours. Then there's Focalin XR, so it contains 50% of the instant release beads and 50% enteric-coated delayed release beads, has a duration of action of 8 to 12 hours. And then dexmethylphenidate has a prodrug. Remember how we learned how Vyvanse was a prodrug? But the one for dexmethylphenidate is a little bit confusing. So the prodrug is dexmethylphenidate, so it's just dexmethylphenidate with the amino acid serine attached to it. And it's not entirely clear how the serine gets cleaved. It seems to happen in the gut, but it's not as clear-cut as Vyvanse. So dexmethylphenidate is a Schedule 4 control drug, whereas all the other stimulants we've been talking about are a Schedule 2 control drug. And this sounds great, but the issue is that we can't prescribe dexmethylphenidate on its own. It has a bad pharmacokinetic profile, so it's got a delayed onset of action. So it's not clear if we'll ever actually see it being used by itself. The only formulation that uses it is a medication called Asteres. So it contains 30% of immediate release dexmethylphenidate to make up for the delayed onset of action, and then 70% of the dexmethylphenidate. So that's nice and all that it's 70% Schedule 4 drug, but the fact that it has any dexmethylphenidate means that it's a Schedule 2 drug. So it kind of removes the advantage of being a prodrug in the first place. All right, and then it's worth noting that there are calculators that help you convert to the different medications. There's ADHDmedcalc.com. So this gives very rough estimations of dosing equivalents, but I hope as we've learned that there's different isomer mixtures and different release mechanisms, it's truly impossible to get a perfect conversion. All right, thanks for watching. How to make it better, do it faster, makes us stronger more than ever. Hour after hour, we're just never over.
make it better, do it faster, makes us stronger more than ever. Hour after hour, wait is never over. Learning how to make it better, do it faster, makes us stronger more